Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Salois, and this video is part of my workshop, Podcasts in the Classroom, Creating and Assigning Course-Specific Podcasts, and is sponsored by CUNY's Transformative Learning in the Humanities Initiative. During the live workshop, we'll be covering assigning podcasts for students to listen to, as well as designing a podcast project for students to demonstrate their knowledge on a topic. If you are or were unable to attend that workshop, please feel free to reach out to me for access to that content. This video will go over what to consider when you think you might want to start your own course-specific podcast. I'll be speaking about what worked for me from a humanities perspective, so if you're in another field, you may need to rework a few things, but my hope is that the main ideas still apply. This is a broad overview or introduction and does not give you a step-by-step instruction guide on how to start a podcast. There are expert authors and creators out there who can do that, and some of which I've provided references to below. This is just a little something to help you decide if starting a podcast is right for you and your class. So the first thing you need to ask is, what is my podcast about? For course-specific podcasts, it's best to start with just one course. Don't try to create content for all of your courses at once. It is a lot of work, and it does take a bit of time. Ask what your course is about, right? What do you wish you had more time to cover in your class? Can you talk about that for 15, 30, or maybe even 60 minutes without it sounding like a lecture? That is what your podcast should cover. Then you might ask, well, why do I want to start a podcast? And I suggest that if at least one of your answers to this question is not your students, then it might not be the best idea for a project. Don't get me wrong, if you want to start a podcast for the sake of it, go for it. But if you want to start a course-specific podcast, the student should be on the top of your list. So how do you start a podcast? Well, this answer is quite complex, and there's certainly a learning curve to it all. Do some research. I have a link in the description below to a list of resources that I recommend checking out if you've never podcasted before. My top two recommendations are Podcasting for Dummies and the podcast Better Podcasting. Yes, a podcast about podcasting. There's actually quite a few out there. This one in particular is great, though, because it's for the hobby podcaster. In other words, someone who is not looking at their project as a potential source of income, right? You're not looking for advertisers, etc. Next, you need to figure out where you're going to host it. There are a number of podcast hosting sites out there, and I'm not here to tell you which one is right for you. Many of them will cost you something for unlimited storage, which you will want. And those that don't are maybe questionable at best. My biggest criteria when looking for a platform was something that was accessible, something that could be listened to on the computer, something that I could easily share a link to, and something that had an app. You can always cross-list your podcast on other platforms, and you should. SoundCloud hosts my podcast, and it's also available on Stitcher and Apple Podcast, as well as certain other podcast aggregators. You will have to set this up in advance, but keep in mind that some platforms such as Apple will not approve your podcast until you have at least one episode ready to post. I recommend an introduction episode that serves for Apple's purposes. We might be asking too, what equipment do I need? Some of this is going to depend on your podcast format. If you're interviewing people, if you're working with a partner, which I highly recommend, if you're recording in the same room, or if you're recording virtually. The link in the description below will also provide you with a list of some equipment that I've used, but basically when it comes down to it, you need a microphone and a device to record on. There will be an upfront cost for this, but really it's up to you how much you decide to spend. What about editing? If you're anything like me or most academics, you will want to edit your podcast. I recommend the software program Audacity. It's a free audio editing program that works on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And it takes a little getting used to, but there are plenty of YouTube tutorials out there that can help you learn it a bit. more. It's great because it's free, and I will provide a link for that below. The big question though, what's the time commitment? Again, this is going to depend on how you approach the project. My podcast episodes were generally a little over an hour in length and had 2 people speaking. In terms of preparation, I probably put 2 to 3 hours into my notes for each episode. Recording sessions were usually an hour and a half, and editing took about 3 hours. So for me, it was 6 to 8 hours per episode. But maybe you take notes faster than I do, or your idea doesn't require taking notes at all. Maybe your episodes are only 30 minutes long. Maybe you decide that the raw audio works for your format. Theoretically, I suppose you could spend less than an hour on each episode. That didn't work for me, but again, it depends on how you approach your own podcast. You're going to want to decide how frequent your episodes will be. Do you plan to release weekly episodes, bi-weekly, monthly? Or maybe you just want to plan a season of episodes and then be done. My first podcast project was bi-weekly, and it took a lot of work. I found it manageable, but it was a lot of work. Currently, I'm developing a new project, and we're planning on a 5-episode seasons, which will be released throughout the semester. This gives us time between semesters to do a lot of the heavy legwork. Basically, there's no one answer for this. The time commitment is what you make it. All right, other advice. Well, if you have a co-host, which again, I recommend, start a Google folder with all of your information. Doing this allowed both of us to work on the content when it was convenient for us without having to email back and forth. The Google folder allows you to set up a template for your episodes, keep a record of topics covered or to be covered, and it's just an overall convenient way to organize the work related to the podcast. I'd recommend getting a hard drive that's on the bigger side. Audio files can be quite large, and you'll want to save a copy of the original audio as well as an edited version of the audio. Trust me on this, I lost just a few minutes of content from one of my episodes, but it was extremely frustrating. And if I'd saved the original and also a copy, I would have been able to recover it. Instead, I had to record something to fill in for it. Listen to other podcasts. What do you like about their formatting? What would you do differently? What is it you enjoy about listening to these podcasts? And how can you bring your own version of this to your podcast? These are just a few questions to ask as you sit down to start your project. Basically, make sure you enjoy it. That's going to come through in your recording. The students can come to class to listen to a lecture, or maybe not if that's not your style, but make this different. Make this fun. Make it a supplement to the things you already do and not a repeat of the same things that they come to class and hear. Above all, just get started. Don't overplan. It won't be perfect at first, or maybe ever, but it will be out there and it will help both you and the students. So I hope this little introduction helped you just get an idea of whether starting a podcast project is right for you. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or send me an email, contact me through the social media platforms at Why Do We Read This? And I'll be happy to chat with you some more. Thanks so much. Bye.